North Carolina has been looking into changing the way public schools are funded in the state. And one person who's been watching the discussion with interest is Aaron Smith. He is education policy analyst for the Libertarian Reason Foundation. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me today.
Why is this such an important topic for people to know about?
Well, school finance is obviously a very important topic. So as a country, we spend about $600 billion every year on K through 12 education. In North Carolina in particular, that number is about $13 billion when you account for local, state, and federal funding. So from a finance issue, strictly a fiscal perspective, it's very important because we're allocating a lot of dollars towards it. But what doesn't get a lot of play is regardless of how much we're spending, so whether we spend more, less, or the same per pupil on education, is that how we allocate those dollars impacts what happens in classrooms. And that's true both for teachers and for students as well.
Now, you have looked at other states, and from a sort of a national perspective, when you look at North Carolina and compare it to other states, what do you see? What stands out?
So every school finance formula has its issues. They're all complex to at least some degree, some much better than others. But I would say an honest assessment is that North Carolina's is uniquely bad in a lot of respects. It's very antiquated, so it stems from the 1930s. And instead of allocating actual dollars down to districts, North Carolina allocates staffing positions and uses categorical allotments. And while a lot of people may not really understand what that means, it's basically there's a lot of red tape around how education resources are used. And instead of making decisions locally, they're made centrally by the state so that districts and schools and school leaders, such as principals, can actually make decisions with how dollars are spent.
Why is that a problem?
Because you want decisions to be made as locally as possible, because only a principal and a teacher really knows the needs of their school. And so you can compare two schools and look at their allocation patterns in terms of how dollars are expended, and they might get very different results. And so what that shows is there's no one way to fund a successful education. It needs to be locally responsive. And to do that, you need to empower principals to make trade-offs. And so the question is, who do you want making the trade-offs? Do you want state officials to make the trade-offs, district officials, or do you want principals and teachers to make the trade-offs in terms of how dollars are spent? And there's a good amount of research that shows when you empower local decision makers to make those trade-offs, kids win.
We are chatting with Aaron Smith. He is an education policy analyst with the Reason Foundation. And so given your assessment that North Carolina is uniquely bad in its system, are you encouraged that some folks are talking about perhaps making a change?
I'm very encouraged. And I'm encouraged by one thing to begin with, and that's there seems to be widespread agreement that the formula needs changing, that it's antiquated and it's very inefficient. And so that's a positive. Now, in terms of what to do next, there seems to be a little bit of a disagreement, but I think the idea of moving towards a model that uses weighted student funding to allocate dollars is certainly gaining traction and is something that legislatures should certainly pursue.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to give you an idea of what I think you mean by the weighted student funding. That basically, rather than giving school districts money based on you're going to have X number of teachers or X number of textbooks, you would say you have this number of students, you're going to get this amount per student with certain weights added in for special categories?
Yep, for special needs, for economically disadvantaged English language learners. And so that's basically how it operates. And so instead of funding programs, such as, North Carolina has 37 separate allotments, like a summer reading program and technology. And not to say those things aren't important, but you're funding kids and allowing district and school officials to actually make the call on how those dollars are spent.
If North Carolina does make a change, is it basically going to be following in the footsteps of some states that do it right, or at least do it better?
Not necessarily, but I hope so. And you might be prepared to hear this, but California is actually a model of a state that is doing really good things with school finance. So back in 2013, they implemented the local control funding formula, which drastically simplified how they divvy up dollars. And so they were similar to North Carolina in that they had about 50 plus categorical allotments, which basically funded everything under the sun and came with a lot of red tape. And right now, and so they're about 6 years into implementation, and the early research on it is very positive. Superintendents and principals are happy and satisfied with the change. One big takeaway is that they're better able to align resources with their actual goals and strategies, so what they want to accomplish. They can direct more resources towards those things.
Now, a lot of people will have fights about how much funding is the proper amount of funding. What you're talking about doesn't really have anything to do with the level of funding, but making sure what funding you do have is used most efficiently and effectively, right?
Exactly. So regardless of how much we're spending on K through 12 education, there are good ways to allocate the funding and there are bad ways to allocate the funding. And so what I'm saying is we need to be more efficient and we need to empower those who are closest to children, including parents as well. And so what a lot of people don't realize is that a school finance formula is very much related to school choice. And so if you have a lot of inefficiencies in your formula, especially a lot of inequities and where dollars don't follow the child, school choice becomes very difficult to implement. And if you do have school choice programs, it's more difficult to grow. And that's one thing that we've seen in California is that with these changes, they have a very fair and transparent system. School choice has expanded rapidly. There's about 150,000 students now in California who cross district boundaries to pursue better options for their families. And the same is true in Indiana as well. So they made some pretty big changes in Indiana to promote a better funding system. And as a result, school choice has literally exploded in Indiana in a very positive way.
This is not a brand new discussion, and when this has come up before the General Assembly in the past, some people have said, I hear what you're saying about more local decision making, but some of these locals are going to make bad decisions. We in Raleigh need to be the ones dictating things. Why is that not the right approach?
It's not the right approach because what you really want to focus on is outcomes and not inputs. And so instead of dictating how resources are used and what districts do, you want to focus on how they're performing. And so looking at things like student outcomes and parental satisfaction. And so instead of dictating what they're doing, let's look at outcomes. And one way to achieve this is through transparency. So more transparency around financial reporting and how districts allocate dollars and actually spend dollars. And more transparency in terms of outcomes as well and test scores and being able to actually line those things up and to show how schools are performing, lining up test scores with the dollars allocated and spent.